The air at the Hemlock Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a miserable cocktail of late August humidity, diesel fumes, and the unmistakable scent of failure. It was the smell of a man's life being sold off piece by piece, the vultures circling to pick the bones clean. I stood near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my '67 Chevy C50, the grain box still holding the dust of last year's soybeans. My name is Elias Thorne, and I wasn't there to buy. I was there to watch, to learn, and maybe find a cheap set of cultivators for my old Farmall M. My father, God rest his soul, had farmed this same land for 40 years. He'd left me 80 acres, a solid old barn, a house that was paid for, and not a single penny of debt. He'd also left me a John Deere 40 he'd bought new in '68, and a belief hammered into me like a stubborn fence post that the bank was a tool for other men. "The interest, son," he'd say, his voice raspy from years of breathing field dust. "It grows faster than corn and it never sleeps. You stay clear of it." So I did. I farmed with what I had. The 4020 was my main workhorse, its 6-cylinder diesel as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. For lighter work, I'd fire up my granddad's Farmall, its narrow front end waddling through the rows. I was a relic, and I knew it. That's why Richard Sterling loved to see me. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," a voice boomed behind me. "Come to pick through the scraps, Thorne?" I turned slowly. Rich Sterling stood there, leaning against the gleaming chrome grille of his brand-new Ford F-250. He had on a clean seed corn hat, pressed jeans, and boots that hadn't seen a lick of mud. His farm bordered mine to the west, a sprawling empire of 1,000 acres he'd bought with the bank's money. His father, who ran the local production credit association, had co-signed on everything. Rich farmed with brand-new, cherry-red International Harvester equipment. His tractors had air-conditioned cabs and radios. Mine had a sun-faded umbrella and the drone of the engine. "Just lookin', Rich," I said, my voice flat. "Yeah, that's what you always say." He laughed, a loud, obnoxious sound that drew a few looks. "You know, my new 1480 combine has a grain monitor. Tells me the yield right down to the bushel. What's your 4020 got? An oil pressure gauge that maybe works?" I just nodded and turned back toward the auctioneer's chant. Arguing with Rich was like wrestling a hog in the mud. You both get dirty, and the hog likes it. The auctioneer moved down the line of tired, sun-bleached equipment, a rusty disc, a planter with cracked seed boxes, a hay rake with missing teeth. Each piece told a story of a long, losing battle. Then they came to it, the centerpiece of the tragedy. It was a Gleaner N7 combine, and it was a monster. Even sitting there, dead and silent, it was imposing. It was one of the first rotary combines, a beast from the late '70s that was supposed to change everything. This one had changed everything for old man Hemlock, all right. It had broken him. One of its massive rear tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split like an old boot. The sheet metal was faded to a chalky orange, with long, weeping streaks of rust bleeding from every bolt. Someone had taken a can of red spray paint and scrawled the word "scrap" in jagged letters across the grain head. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Miller, didn't even try to dress it up. "All right, boys, here she is. The big one. Engines locked up, tighter than a drum, word is. Bank says sell it for what it'll bring. Let's start the bidding at scrap price. Who'll give me $500 for the whole pile? $500 to haul it away." Silence. A few guys chuckled. Rich Sterling guffawed, making sure everyone heard him. $500? Miller, you ought to pay someone to take that anchor off your hands. The crowd laughed with him. I stared at the machine. I wasn't seeing the rust or the flat tire. I was seeing the frame, straight and true. I was seeing the final drives, massive planetary gears that looked untouched. And I was seeing the engine cover. It was an Alice Chalmers 670T, a 426 cubic inch, turbocharged diesel, a tough, reliable engine if you treated it right. Hemlock hadn't. I'd heard the stories. He'd run it hot, day and night, trying to get his crop out before the bank called his notes. He'd pushed it until it quit, and then it had pushed him right off his farm. "Come on, gentlemen, scrap iron's worth that," Miller pleaded. 400. Anybody at 400. Something moved in me. A quiet, stubborn spark my father had passed down. It was the same instinct that made me rebuild a carburetor instead of buying a new one. The same feeling that made me weld a cracked hitch instead of calling it junk. I saw past the ruin. I saw potential. I lifted a finger. Just a slight twitch. Miller's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, caught it. "I've got 400 from Mr. Thorne. Now who'll give me 450? 450? A murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned to look at me. I could feel Rich Sterling's eyes boring into the side of my head. He was stunned into silence, his mouth hanging open. He couldn't believe it. No one could. 400 once, 400 twice. Miller scanned the crowd, his gaze lingering on Rich for a moment, daring him to bid. Rich just shook his head in disgust. "Sold for $400 to Elias Thorne." The gavel fell, and the sound echoed in the sudden quiet. It felt like I had just bought the whole world's judgment for $400. Rich walked over to me, his face a mask of contemptuous pity. "What in God's name are you going to do with that pile of junk, Thorne?" he sneered. "The engine is seized. You know what that means? It's a boat anchor. You going to use it for a chicken coop?" "Maybe," I said, meeting his gaze. I didn't have a plan. All I had was a feeling, a deep-down conviction that there was still life in that machine, that it deserved a second chance, that we both did. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what was wrong with that old gleaner, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever seen a man bet his entire future on something everyone else called worthless? Let me know in the comments what you think was running through my mind right then, because the whole county, Rich Sterling included, thought I'd finally lost it. They thought the Thorne family farm was about to become the next auction on the calendar. Getting the N7 home was a battle in itself. The thing weighed close to 30,000 pounds, and its rear steering axle was frozen in a slight turn. It was less a machine and more a monument to bad luck. I couldn't afford a professional heavy hauler, so I went to see a man named Gus Henderson. Gus was in his 70s, a retired farmer who had known my father for 50 years. He had an old beat-up Diamond T-truck with a lowboy trailer he used to move his old bulldozer around. "You bought the Hemlock anchor?" Gus asked, stroking his white beard as I explained my predicament. He squinted at me. "Your dad would either call you a genius or a damned fool. I ain't sure which yet, but he'd help you either way. So will I." The next day, we were back at the Hemlock place. The crowd was gone, leaving only the ghosts of a failed dream. We used 2 heavy-duty come-alongs and a series of chains hooked to Gus's bulldozer to winch the combine onto the trailer. It was a slow, groaning, metal-on-metal symphony of struggle. The steel cables sang with tension, the pulleys squealed in protest, and every inch the gleaner moved felt like a victory. It took us 4 hours. The drive back to my farm was 5 miles of pure terror. Gus drove his old Diamond T, its engine roaring, while I followed in my pickup, watching the enormous crippled machine sway on the trailer. Every farmer we passed stopped their tractor in the field to stare. Cars slowed down, the drivers gawking at the spectacle. I could read their faces. There goes that Thorn boy, dragging his foolishness home for all to see. We finally got it into my yard and maneuvered it into the main bay of the barn, the same barn my grandfather had built with hand-hewn beams. The combine filled the space, its rusty bulk blocking out the sun and making the familiar space feel small and foreign. Gus and I stood there for a long moment, looking at it. "Well, son," he said, clapping a dusty hand on my shoulder. "You got it here. Now the real work begins." And he was right. For the rest of that fall and all through the winter, that gleaner became my world, after my own harvest was in, a frantic, exhausting affair, using a small, pull-type John Deere combine that was barely adequate for my 80 acres. I turned my full attention to the N7. The first step was a full diagnosis. I drained the engine oil, and my heart sank. It came out in a thick, milky, grey sludge. Water. A lot of it. That was a bad sign. It could mean a cracked block or a blown head gasket. I drained the diesel from the tank. It was thick with algae and smelled sour. I spent a week just cleaning. I pressure-washed every inch of the machine, blasting away years of caked-on grease, dirt, and chaff. Underneath the grime, I found solid steel. Then I went after the engine. I pulled the valve cover off the big Alice Chalmers diesel. The sight wasn't pretty. One of the rocker arm assemblies was shattered, the pieces lying in the oily sludge of the cylinder head. A pushrod beneath it was bent into a perfect L shape. This was the immediate cause of the seizure, but it was a symptom, not the disease. I spent the next 2 days pulling the radiator. It was a massive, heavy unit, and I had to rig a chain hoist to the barn rafters to get it out. Once it was on the floor, I saw the real problem. The cooling fins were packed solid, a dense mat of corn husks, soybean dust, and dirt. Air couldn't get through it. Old Man Hemlock, in his rush, had never taken the time to blow it out. The engine had suffocated. It had overheated to the point that the oil broke down, a valve stuck, and the piston came up and smashed everything to pieces. It was death by neglect. The news of my project spread through the county like wildfire, fanned by the hot air of Rich Sterling's bragging at the grain co-op. "Heard Elias Thorne is trying to resurrect that junk pile," he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear. Guess he's more mechanic than farmer these days. Too bad you can't take a wrench to the bank. Men who had respected my father now looked at me with pity. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, the same man who held Rich Sterling's notes, made a special trip out to my farm. He walked into my barn, his shiny city shoes looking ridiculous on the oil-stained concrete floor. "Elias," he said, shaking his head as he looked at the disassembled engine, "I admire your work ethic, son. Your father was the same way. But this is a waste of your time and money. There's a new line of credit available. We could have you in a new John Deere combine by next fall. It's about efficiency. You can't build a future with another man's failures." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy," I said, wiping my greasy hands on a rag. "But I'd rather build it with my own 2 hands." He left, shaking his head. The isolation was profound. I was a young man on an island of my own making. I spent my savings on parts. I found a used cylinder head at a salvage yard in Illinois, a 6-hour drive each way. I ordered new gaskets, bearings, and a new rocker assembly. I honed the cylinders myself and installed new piston rings. I meticulously cleaned every part of that engine, from the fuel injectors to the oil pan. While I was covered in grease, Rich was expanding. He bought another 80 acres that bordered my property. I'd watch from my barn door as his new Steiger tractor, a four-wheel drive behemoth, pulled a 24-foot field cultivator, turning over more ground in an hour than I could in a day. The contrast was a constant, grinding reminder of the path I hadn't taken. My path was slower, dirtier, and lonelier. But as I torqued the last bolt on that rebuilt cylinder head, I felt a flicker of hope. This path was mine. The first half of the 1970s was a gold rush for farmers in the heartland. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. grain crop. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent prices into the stratosphere. Soybeans doubled, corn tripled. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, was on the radio telling us to plant fence row to fence row. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a way of life. It was a ticket to wealth. Land values soared. A kind of fever swept through the county. Optimism was the new cash crop, and everyone was planting it. Everyone except me. For men like Rich Sterling, it was vindication. His high-risk, high-debt strategy paid off spectacularly. With sky-high commodity prices, his massive loan payments were suddenly manageable. He was a genius. He leased another 200 acres, bought a bigger grain truck, and paved the driveway to his house. He traded in his 2-year-old International 1480 for the brand-new 1482 model, which had a digital monitoring system and a cab so quiet you could hear the radio clearly over the engine. He was the golden boy, the living proof that to make money you had to borrow big and bet on the future. Meanwhile, I was finally ready to test my own bet. It was a hot afternoon in late July when I finished reassembling the gleaner. I had rebuilt the engine, patched the holes in the grain bin, re-welded a dozen cracks in the frame, and put a new tube in the flat tire. I filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with 30 quarts of new Rotella oil. I bled the fuel lines and primed the injectors. With a deep breath, I climbed into the cab. The seat was cracked vinyl, the gauges were faded, and the whole space smelled of mouse nests and old hydraulic fluid. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the big diesel over slowly, painfully. 1 revolution. 2. It felt like an eternity. Then, a cough, a puff of white smoke from the exhaust pipe. I turned the key again. More groaning, then another cough, this time followed by a cloud of black smoke that billowed out of the barn. And then it happened. The engine caught. It stumbled for a moment, then roared to life with a deep, throaty bellow that shook the very timbers of the old barn. It wasn't the smooth, quiet hum of Rich Sterling's new machines. This was a raw, mechanical thunder. It was the sound of resurrection. I sat there for a full minute, my hand on the throttle, feeling the vibration run through my entire body. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. That fall, I took my first harvest with the N7. It wasn't perfect. A hydraulic line blew, a bearing went out on the unloading auger. But it ran. It chewed through my 80 acres of corn and soybeans with an appetite I'd never seen. I was doing in one day what used to take me a week with my old pull-type machine. The money was good, better than my father had ever seen. The boom was real. But I remembered his words. When I sold my grain, I took the check to the bank and paid off the small operating note I'd taken out for seed and fertilizer. Then I bought new sickle sections for the gleaner's grain head and a better set of tires for my old C50 truck. I paid cash for everything. The rest of the money, a substantial sum, I put into a savings account. My discipline was seen as eccentricity, as failure. Rich would see me at the parts store, buying a seal kit for an old hydraulic cylinder, while he was ordering a whole new unit for one of his tractors. "Still pinching pennies, Thorne?" he'd ask with a smirk. You know, the bank's got money to lend. You could upgrade that old junk. The community saw me living the same way I always had, driving the same old truck, wearing the same patched overalls. They saw Rich building a new machine shed, taking his wife on a vacation to Florida, buying his kids new dirt bikes. They didn't see my bank account growing. They saw a man who was too scared to take a risk, a man who had stumbled into one good year but lacked the vision to build an empire like Rich Sterling. They saw a fool who'd polished a piece of scrap metal while the wise man was building a castle. The years rolled on. The boom continued, fueled by inflation and relentless optimism. It was 1979. I was at the co-op, waiting in line to pay for a bag of bolts, when Rich came in, slapping the manager on the back. "Just signed the papers on the old Miller place," he announced to the room. "Another 200 acres. You know, interest rates are climbing, but the bank gave me a hell of a deal on the financing. Variable rate, but they say it's the smart way to go." He looked over at me. "You got to spend money to make money, right, Elias?" I just nodded and paid for my bolts, in cash. The co-op manager smiled at Rich, then gave me a look of polite pity. Driving home in my old Chevy, the radio was on. A news announcer with a serious voice was talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He was talking about a new monetary policy, about raising interest rates to unprecedented levels to break the back of inflation. I didn't understand the complex economics of it all, but I understood the words, raising interest rates. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out into the yard and looked west. Across the fields, the mercury vapor lights of Rich Sterling's new machine should cast a brilliant, arrogant glow against the dark sky. It was a monument to debt, a castle built on the shifting sands of bank loans and variable rates. And I felt a storm coming, a quiet, invisible storm that had nothing to do with the weather. A storm that was going to wash some men away and leave others standing on solid ground. And for the first time, I felt a grim certainty about which one I would be. The first sign of the coming storm was the silence of the rain. The spring of 1980 started dry and stayed that way. By June, the corn in my fields, which should have been knee-high, was barely up to my shins, the leaves a pale, sickly green. The ground cracked open in long, thirsty fissures. Every afternoon, the sky would turn a hazy, brassy color, promising thunderstorms that never came. Across the fence line, Rich Sterling's fields looked just as bad, maybe worse. His corn was planted thicker, a newer hybrid that demanded more water. He ran his massive center pivot irrigation system day and night, but it was a losing battle. The diesel engine powering the pump droned on endlessly, a constant expensive hum that echoed across the parched landscape. I heard at the co-op he was burning through 500 gallons of diesel a week just on that one pivot. My old gleaner sat in the barn, ready for a harvest that looked thinner by the day. I spent my time cultivating, trying to keep the weeds from stealing what little moisture there was. My Farmall M, with its skinny tires, sipped fuel, and when a hydraulic hose on my cultivator split, I drove into town, bought a new one for $12, and had it fixed in an hour. One afternoon, I saw Rich's new Steiger tractor sitting idle in the middle of his field. A service truck from the dealership was parked beside it, the mechanic in his clean uniform looking perplexed. I saw Rich pacing back and forth, waving his arms. Later, I learned from Gus Henderson that a computer board controlling the transmission had failed. The part had to be ordered from the factory in Fargo, and it cost $2,000. The tractor sat there for a week, a green and yellow monument to modern vulnerability. The cracks in his empire were starting to show in other ways. He used to be the first one at the diner in the morning, buying coffee for everyone. Now, I'd see his Ford pickup roar past, heading straight for the fields before dawn. The easy confidence in his walk was gone, replaced by a hurried, anxious stride. The laughter that used to boom across the co-op was replaced by tense, clipped conversations on the payphone with someone I assumed was his father at the bank. The drought broke in late July, not with gentle showers, but with a violent, hail-spewing thunderstorm that flattened what was left of the crops. It was a disaster for everyone, but for a man leveraged to the hilt, it was a catastrophe. That fall, the grain prices that had been our saving grace began to slide. The government had announced an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union. The market, already nervous, panicked. The price of corn dropped 30 cents a bushel in a single week. It was around then that Rich's brand-new International 1482 combine broke down. He was trying to salvage what he could of his hail-damaged soybeans when the main rotor drive failed. It wasn't a simple bearing or a belt. It was a complex, planetary gearbox deep in the guts of the machine. The dealership told him it would take 3 weeks to get the parts and would cost him nearly $10,000 in labor and materials. He came to my farm one evening. It was the first time he'd ever set foot in my yard voluntarily. He didn't drive his big new truck. He walked across the field. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale under his seed corn hat. "Thorn," he said, not meeting my eye. He just stared at my old gleaner, which I was greasing for my own meager harvest. I heard you got that thing running pretty good." "She does all right," I said, pumping grease into a zerk fitting on the straw chopper. He kicked at a loose stone on the ground. "Look, the dealer's got me in a bind. I need to get my beans out before they rot in the field. I was wondering if you'd consider doing some custom harvesting for me." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Rich Sterling, the man with the newest and the best, was asking me, the man with the resurrected junk pile, to come save his crop. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a torch. I could have said no. I could have savored the moment, thrown his own words back in his face. But looking at him, I didn't see the arrogant man who had mocked me. I saw a farmer, just like me, backed into a corner by bad luck and bad timing. "I'll be done with my own beans in 2 days," I said, my voice even. "I can start on your north section after that. Standard rate." He looked up, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes other than arrogance or pity. It was a flicker of desperation, quickly masked. "Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Thorn." He turned and walked away. For the next week, the deep-throated roar of the Alice Chalmers engine in my Gleaner N7 echoed across his fields. I ran from sunup to sundown, the old machine gobbling up his soybeans. It wasn't a pretty sight. The hail damage was severe, and the yield was terrible. But we got it done. When I finished, he handed me a check. His hand was trembling slightly. It was the first real money his operation had seen all year, and he was giving it to me. The turning point wasn't just in our fortunes. It was in the ground beneath our feet, and it was beginning to crumble under him. The winter of 1981 was brutal, but the economic winter that followed was worse. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, cranked interest rates up to fight inflation. They went from 10% to 15%, then to 20%. The prime rate hit 21.5%. For farmers who had borrowed heavily on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The smart way to go, as Rich had called it, had become a guillotine. Every trip into town felt like attending a wake. The chatter at the diner wasn't about crop yields, it was about interest payments that had doubled or tripled overnight. It was about hushed conversations and hollow-eyed men staring into their coffee cups. Foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper, small print tragedies listed among ads for tractor parts and livestock feed. Farms that had been in the same family for 100 years were going under, swallowed by the very system that had encouraged them to expand. Rich Sterling was caught in the perfect storm. His income was slashed by the drought and the embargo, while his expenses exploded. The variable rate loans he had taken out to buy the Miller place and all that new equipment were now ticking time bombs. His monthly interest payments were more than my entire farm grossed in a year. He started selling things off. First, it was the new grain truck, then one of the smaller tractors. But it was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a bucket. The debt was too big, the hole too deep. The bank, run by his own father, could no longer protect him. The regulators were breathing down their necks. They had to call the loans. The auction was scheduled for a Saturday in early April. The sale bill was tacked up on the bulletin board at the co-op, a stark, black and white summary of a collapsed dream. Public auction. Richard Sterling. Complete dispersal of farm machinery. The list was long and impressive. The Steiger four-wheel drive, the International 1482 Combine that had been his pride, planters, cultivators, trucks, a lifetime of ambition laid out for public inspection. I went to the auction. I parked my old Chevy C50 next to a line of shiny new pickups and walked toward the crowd. The atmosphere was completely different from the Hemlock auction. That had been a sad affair, but small. This was an event. The fall of the county's biggest operator drew farmers from 3 counties around. There was no joy in it, though. There was a palpable sense of fear, of there but for the grace of God go I. Rich was there, standing beside his father. He looked like a ghost. His face was ashen, his shoulders slumped. He avoided eye contact, staring at a fixed point on the horizon. His father, the banker who had co-signed on this mountain of debt, looked a decade older, his face a mask of grief and regret. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools and shop equipment. Then he moved to the machinery line. The bidding was slow, cautious. The farm economy was in a free fall and no one had much cash. The prices were brutally low. A 5-year-old planter that Rich had paid $30,000 for sold for $6,000. A disc chisel that was practically new went for half its value. With each fall of the gavel, I could see Rich flinch. I stood at the back, just as I had years ago, watching. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to bear witness. My own finances were secure. I had no debt. The money I'd saved during the good years was earning high interest in a savings account. My operating costs were low. While my neighbors were drowning, I was standing on the shore, dry and safe, all because I had listened to an old man's simple wisdom. Then they came to the Steiger, the 4-wheel drive behemoth that had been the symbol of Rich's dominance. It was only 3 years old. The auctioneer started the bidding at $50,000. Silence. He dropped it to 40. A single bid. He tried for 45. Nothing. The crowd knew what was happening. The banks weren't lending. The only buyers were those with cash, and there were precious few of them. "Come on, gentlemen, this is a top-of-the-line machine," the auctioneer pleaded. "$40,000 is all I have. Will anyone give me 41? I thought about Rich carving up the earth with that machine, working more ground in an hour than I could in a day. I thought about the broken computer board and the $2,000 repair bill. But I also knew it was a powerful, capable tractor, and the price was a fraction of its worth. I had the money in the bank. It was a good investment. I raised my hand. 41,000, the auctioneer shouted, his eyes finding me in the crowd. I have 41 from Elias Thorne. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Every head turned to look at me. The man who had bought a junk combine for $400. Rich Sterling's head snapped up. He stared at me, his face a mixture of disbelief, shock, and something I couldn't quite read. Humiliation, maybe. Another man bid 42. I came back immediately with 43. He hesitated, then shook his head. 43,000 once. Twice. The auctioneer looked directly at Rich, as if giving him one last chance to see his empire saved, but there was nothing he could do. Sold for $43,000 to Elias Thorne. The gavel fell, and the sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet spring air. I hadn't just bought a tractor. I had bought the symbol of everything that had separated us, and I had paid cash. After the auctioneer moved on, I walked over to the Clark's trailer to settle up. As I was signing the paperwork, I saw Rich walking toward his house, his shoulders stooped in defeat. His father was talking to the auctioneer, his face grim. The empire was officially gone. The castle had crumbled. I finished my business and walked over to where Rich's father, Mr. Sterling, was standing. He looked up at me, his banker's poise gone, replaced by the simple pain of a father who had watched his son lose everything. "Thorne," he said, his voice husky. "Congratulations on the tractor. It's a good machine." "It is," I agreed. "Mr. Sterling, what's going to happen to the home quarter? The original 80 acres with the house and barns?" He sighed, a long, weary sound. "The bank will have to take it, along with the rest. We'll list it for sale next week." "Don't," I said. He looked at me, confused. "What?" "Don't list it. I'll buy it. The 80, the house, the barns, whatever the bank needs to get for it, I'll pay cash." He stared at me, speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew I had the money. He knew my financial position was solid as bedrock. "Why, Elias?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "After all the rivalry, after the way Richard treated you." "Because your father gave my grandfather his first loan to buy seed back in the 30s, and he carried him through a bad year when he could have foreclosed," I said. "Because this land has been the Sterling farm for 3 generations. It shouldn't have a bank's name on the deed. And because no man should have to watch his family lose their home." I let that sink in. Then I added, "I've got a condition, though. I want you to draw up a rental agreement. I'll rent the house and the barns back to Rich and his family for $1 a year, for as long as they want to stay. And I could use a good man to help me run the extra ground I just bought. I'll pay him a fair wage." Tears welled up in the old banker's eyes. He, a man who had dealt in millions of dollars and held the fates of countless farmers in his hands, was overcome. He reached out and gripped my arm, his hand trembling. "Thank you, son," he choked out. "Thank you." A week later, the papers were signed. I owned the Sterling home place. Rich and I met in my machine shed, the same place he'd once mocked. He stood there, stripped of all his pride, looking like a stranger in a land he once ruled. "I don't know what to say, Thorne," he mumbled, staring at the concrete floor. "Say you'll show up for work on Monday," I said, handing him a key to the Steiger. "That engine's got a funny noise in the turbo I want you to look at. You know these machines better than I do." He took the key, his fingers closing around it. He looked up and his eyes were clear. The arrogance was gone, washed away by the flood of failure. In its place was a quiet humility and the beginning of a grudging respect. "I'll be here," he said. Life settled into a new rhythm. The 1980s were lean years for everyone. But we survived. We worked side by side, Rich and I. He brought his knowledge of modern equipment, and I brought my caution and my philosophy of avoiding debt. We made a good team. The community, which had once seen us as polar opposites, now saw us as partners. The story of the auction and what followed had spread through the county, and the way people looked at me changed forever. I was no longer the eccentric Thorn boy. I was the man who had been right all along, the man who valued community over conquest. I never expanded much beyond the land I bought that day. I had enough. My father's 80 acres, the Sterling home place, and a few other parcels. It was more than one man needed. The Gleaner N7, my $400 gamble, became a legend in the county. I kept it running year after year. Its orange paint was faded to a pale peach, the cab was battered, and the engine was loud, but every fall it did its job. It was a rolling monument to my father's wisdom. Years later, in the early 90s, my own son, Daniel, was about 10 years old. He was a farm kid, through and through, always in the shop with me, his hands perpetually stained with grease. One sunny October afternoon, we were harvesting the last of the soybeans. I was in the cab of the old Gleaner, and he was sitting on the buddy seat, watching the golden beans pour into the grain tank. "Dad," he said over the roar of the engine, "why do we still use this old thing? Rich says the new combines have computers that tell you everything." I throttled the engine down and looked at him. I pointed to the faded dash, to the simple analog gauges for oil pressure and engine temperature. "Those gauges tell me everything I need to know," I said. "They tell me if the machine is healthy. They don't tell me what the yield is or how much money I'm making. That's not their job. Their job is to tell me the truth about the machine." I swept my hand out toward the fields, toward the barn and the house that were paid for, toward the land that was ours, free and clear. "This combine," I said, my hand resting on the worn steering wheel, "it taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about how much you can grow, or how fast you can go, or how much new iron you can buy. It's about what you owe. This machine doesn't owe the bank a single penny, and because of that, it lets us be free." He was quiet for a long time, watching the reel turn, listening to the familiar rhythm of the sickles. Then he looked up at me, his young face serious, and he nodded. He understood. The legacy wasn't in the land or the machinery. It was in the wisdom. It was in knowing the difference between the shiny promise of easy credit and the solid, lasting value of a life built with your own 2 hands, beholden to no one. The old Gleaner rumbled on, a faithful, rusty heart beating strong in the center of a debt-free empire.